Good afternoon, and welcome to Day 8 of Energy Finance 2020 Online. I'm Sandy Buchanan, Executive Director of the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Our session today is called Under Pressure, the impetus for overbuilding pipelines and how to stop it. Our moderator is Rebecca Sale, the Executive Director of the Property Rights and Pipeline Center in New York. Rebecca previously worked for the Broadway Green Alliance and Grow NYC. And now let me bring Rebecca in to get us started.
Thanks very much, Sandy. I'm very excited to be talking about pipelines right now when a lot has been going on in the last couple of months about pipelines. And I'm thrilled to be joined by three experts today to talk about it. We've got Suzanne Mattei, who's an energy policy analyst at IEFA. She's a former regional director of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and is an attorney with 30 years of experience in public interest law and policy. I'm also happy to be joined by David Bookbinder, who's the chief counsel at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. And David has litigated dozens of cases under all of the major environmental statutes, including as Sierra Club's chief climate counsel. We're happy also to have Professor Alexandra Klass, who teaches and writes in the areas of energy law, environmental law, natural resources law, and property law, and currently teaches at the University of Minnesota Law School. So to start us off, I want to first say this is how we do questions. So if you've been to other sessions, you might know this, but for those of you out there, if you have any questions for me or for the speakers, we'd of course love to hear them. So on the right-hand side of the live feed, you'll see a chat box with 3 tabs. The first tab labeled chat is a live discussion where you can share your opinions and reactions to the session with other audience members. The second tab is labeled questions. This is where you should type in your questions you want the speakers to answer. If someone else has a question you like, please click the thumbs up and that question will be pushed to the top of the list. We will not be using the poll tab in this session, but I hope people will listen closely to these presentations and have a lot of great questions to ask. I know I have a few questions too. So let's start off with Suzanne Mattei. Suzanne?
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Suzanne Mattei. I work as an energy policy analyst with IEFA and am with the consulting firm of Lookout Hill Public Policy Associates. I'm going to sketch a pipeline battle that took place in New York. It involved the Williams Corporation, who had a plan to build a $1 billion pipeline that would take fracked gas from Pennsylvania into New York City and Long Island in order to service the local gas utility. Williams made 2 main arguments in support of this pipeline. First, they said they really needed to replace a bunch of old smoky boilers in buildings throughout the area. That turned out not to be true. Most of those boilers had already converted a long time ago. The few that were left could not possibly justify the construction of a gigantic pipeline. Then they argued, well, it's really needed for future growth. But that didn't hold up either. In fact, the Long Island Power Association had recently canceled plans to expand their fossil gas energy production plant construction or expansion. They determined it's too expensive and we don't need it. And they moved straight to renewables and energy efficiency. But none of these arguments mattered to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They really did not care about any of those arguments. All they wanted to know was, is there a contract in place for this gas? And it didn't really matter even if the buyer was a subsidiary of the builder. All they wanted to know was there was a contract in place. So the fact that a third of the energy need that had been identified just by installing heat pumps in small residential buildings and in homes, they didn't want to hear about it. The city had determined that you could reduce energy usage in multi-residential buildings just by separating the water heating system from the space heating system. 16% reduction, they didn't want to hear about it. The fact that this pipeline would primarily be used for peak periods when the energy use spikes, which only happens a few days out of the year, and there are peak demand management systems that can shave that down, they didn't want to hear it. Was there a contract? That's all they wanted to know. So FERC produced an environmental impact statement that completely failed to analyze whether or not the pipeline was needed. And they issued the permit. But the state denied the water quality certification. The utility claimed it was going to do a moratorium and that nobody could get hooked up at all. And the Public Service Commission instituted an enforcement action that resulted in the company being required to develop a long-term needs plan. The advocates were smart and demanded that it be a public process. And that essentially became the environmental impact statement that FERC should have done. The result was utility dropped the projected need by 2/3, hiked alternatives, found other alternative approaches, and basically we ended up avoiding a massive infrastructure construction. But there's still pressure out there to build new pipelines, even when the need is not compelling. And that has to do with the return on investment that pipeline companies are allowed. It's huge. It's been 14 to 15%. FERC has just recently developed a new guidance. So maybe they may shave a few percentage points off of that, but it's still going to be very attractive. And the utilities, they get a return on investment for the small distribution pipes and other infrastructure that they put into the system. And that's attractive to them. That's 9 to 10% return on investment. So we do need a new business model. We do need federal action to improve the quality of decision-making in order to have better decisions on energy going forward. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra Klass. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today about some recent developments in the areas of eminent domain for pipelines, both oil pipelines and natural gas pipelines. So first, let's back up. Eminent domain is used for a variety of purposes, and eminent domain is the power of governments, either the federal government or state governments, to take private property for a public use so long as just compensation is paid to the property owner. And those requirements are in the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution, as well as in almost every state constitution. And the government uses eminent domain all the time to build highways and roads, for economic development and economic redevelopment projects. And most people are familiar with that use of eminent domain. But the government also delegates some of that eminent domain authority to private parties when it wants private parties to have assistance in building projects. One example of that is oil and gas pipelines, where either Congress or states, as the case may be, delegates eminent domain authority to those companies. So those companies then have the power to bring an eminent domain action in their own name to get private property to use to build an oil pipeline or a gas pipeline. Same with electric transmission lines. States often delegate eminent domain authority to electric utilities to build electric transmission lines. So the government uses eminent domain for projects, and private parties also have authority to use eminent domain for certain types of projects that the government has deemed to be a public use. So eminent domain did not used to be all that controversial, except of course to the landowners whose property was taken. That all changed though in 2005 when there was a very controversial Supreme Court decision called Kelo versus City of New London that had nothing to do with pipelines. So in that case, the court held, it was a 5-4 case, so it was very closely decided, that a city could use eminent domain for a redevelopment project to revitalize a distressed city. This was the city of New London, Connecticut. And why was this a public use? Because it would create jobs, it would increase tax revenues, and that was enough to be a public use under the Fifth Amendment. And there was a long line of Supreme Court cases that had reached similar conclusions. But for whatever reason, the facts of this case, the time it was decided, there was a lot of public backlash over this decision. People couldn't believe that that was the law. And as a result, states in more than 40 states amended their state constitutions or enacted new statutes to limit the use of eminent domain for these types of economic redevelopment projects. Now, because this case was about the government use of eminent domain and it was about the use of eminent domain for these economic redevelopment projects, the statutory reform in these states was limited to those types of projects. So it focused on limiting government use of eminent domain, and it really didn't have anything to do with pipelines. It didn't focus on the private party use of eminent domain that had previously been defined as a public use under state law. But remember, Kelo was decided in 2005. 2 years later, fracking begins. We have the fracking revolution in the United States. All of a sudden, we have new sources of oil and gas in new locations. We have gas in Pennsylvania. We have oil in North Dakota. So there's a real need for new energy transport infrastructure to transport the gas from Pennsylvania and the oil from North Dakota, and of course, all the new oil and gas that we now have in Texas and Oklahoma, even more so than before. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of focus on building new oil pipelines, new gas pipelines. Right around the same time, we also have a growing concern in the US over climate change and the role of fossil fuels in exacerbating climate change. And because we have all this new oil and gas, there's also new opportunities for US companies to export that oil and gas. So all of this change is happening after the Kelo reforms have taken place in sort of 2005, 2006. Now in 2007, there's more use of eminent domain for these types of fossil fuel projects. So eminent domain is different when you're talking about an oil pipeline versus a gas pipeline. So for a company that wants to build an interstate natural gas pipeline, they go to the federal government, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and that commission determines whether the pipeline is required by present or future public convenience and necessity. If the commission determines that it is, they grant the pipeline a certificate of public convenience and necessity, and the pipeline then has nationwide eminent domain authority to build that pipeline. For oil pipelines, it's different. Federal authority was never created over interstate oil pipelines, so that's all done at the state level. If you want to build an interstate oil pipeline, you need to get a permit if it's required, and you need eminent domain authority in every state in which the pipeline runs. As I mentioned before, the backlash to the Kelo case in the states really didn't change these laws. They left these laws alone. But there's been more recent developments. We now have partnerships between environmental groups and property rights advocates. These are groups that don't normally work together, but they each have their own interests in limiting eminent domain authority for fossil fuel infrastructure. So they're working together to oppose a lot of oil and gas pipelines around the country. And I list here on this slide of the public opposition over the use of eminent domain for some very high profile pipelines. The Keystone XL pipeline, Dakota Access, Palmetto, Sable Trail, Mountain Valley, Atlantic Coast, Penn East, Nexus, and there's others as well. So lots of opposition, lots of funding for those groups to be able to bring lawsuits opposing the use of eminent domain for these projects. There's also been some state law moratoria on eminent domain for oil pipelines and additional state court scrutiny as to whether eminent domain for oil and gas projects are actually a public use under state law. So I'll talk about each of these last two. So there was a controversial pipeline called the Palmetto Pipeline in the Southeast. And as a result of public opposition to that pipeline, both South Carolina and Georgia enacted bans on the use of eminent domain, moratoria, for a certain period of time while they each created sort of stricter standards for the use of eminent domain for oil pipelines and for siting permits for those oil pipelines as well. They weren't necessarily motivated by concerns over climate change, but they were concerned with the use of eminent domain and the interference with property rights. So this was a big deal. State courts have also increased their scrutiny of eminent domain for these types of projects. So as I mentioned before, we got lots of gas in Pennsylvania now as a result of fracking. And so the legislature passed a number of laws to make it easier to build natural gas infrastructure. One of those was granting eminent domain authority to natural gas companies to take private property to store natural gas. And there are laws like that that exist in lots of states that have historically have gas production. So Texas, Oklahoma, even California, eminent domain is used for this purpose all the time. It was used, it was new, of course, though, in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania only recently had a big natural gas industry. So the court surprisingly found that taking property for natural gas storage is not a public use under the Fifth Amendment, under the Kelo case, or under the Pennsylvania Constitution. They found that the law benefited private gas companies and there was not enough of a public benefit for it to be a public use. Even in Texas, there has been some pushback with regard to eminent domain for pipelines. And Texas is a state where if you want to build a pipeline, all you got to do is check a box saying you're a common carrier and you build the pipeline. There's no additional process or procedure or permits that you need. But even there, the court said, well, if a carbon dioxide pipeline, and carbon dioxide is used to help produce oil, if the carbon dioxide pipeline is only for the private company's use, you're not selling space on that pipeline to others, well, then you can't use eminent domain. So even in Texas, there's been some pushback with regard to that. On the federal side, with natural gas pipelines, there's been numerous lawsuits that we'll talk about later in this session challenging the use of eminent domain for these projects. I list here the Oberlin case that involves a pipeline that in part would export natural gas to Canada. And the DC Circuit asked FERC to explain a little more carefully why a project like that was required for the public convenience and necessity. Does the public include exports of natural gas to Canada? And cited the Fifth Amendment takings clause. So FERC will respond to that, but the fact that the court even asked is notable. The same issues are going to come up in the Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas project that's making its way through the courts right now. Is it a public use? Can you use eminent domain under the Natural Gas Act to build a project where any public use would be exporting gas to another country? So all of these cases are making their way through the courts, and it may result in some changes, both as a judicial matter and as a regulatory matter to the review process and eminent domain authority for pipelines. So to end here, I want to just raise a few points about the use of eminent domain more broadly. So I think about eminent domain as an incentive. It's an incentive that the government gives to private parties to build infrastructure, build projects that the government wants the private sector to build for them. So states and Congress can determine what types of infrastructure they want to promote through various incentives, including eminent domain. So there's nothing to say that a legislature can't withdraw eminent domain authority that was previously given. For many decades, we wanted to encourage private parties to build oil and gas pipelines to produce and transport those products so that citizens of the United States would have access to them. Now we're concerned about climate change. And if a majority of a state legislature or Congress determines that we don't want those projects anymore, they could withdraw that eminent domain authority. I do think we have to exercise caution, though, in terms of limiting eminent domain authority too much. There's lots of infrastructure that we need and that we might want to increase eminent domain authority for. So for instance, renewable energy projects, transmission lines designed to transport wind energy, we may need to increase the use of eminent domain, or at least the authority to use eminent domain for those types of projects, while at the same time advocating for limiting or eliminating eminent domain for projects that are devoted solely to transporting fossil fuels. Last, I think there are lots of opportunities at the federal level and at the state level for procedural reforms and enhanced compensation. I list some of them here, and we can talk about them during the Q&A, but there's lots of opportunities for improved community involvement, enhanced compensation for payment when eminent domain is exercised. And I think there's a lot of opportunities at the state level and at the federal level to make eminent domain, when it's used, more equitable and more fair and more subject to the input of affected landowners. And I list here on the last slide some articles that I've written on these topics for those of you who are interested in learning more about the use of eminent domain for these types of oil and gas projects. And I look forward to the Q&A in the session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is David Bookbinder. I am the Chief Counsel of the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., and we spend a lot of our time dealing with pipelines. We deal with issues surrounding eminent domain, which is the practice that pipelines have, or the authority they get when permitted by either states or the federal government to come and take people's property. And in the last 8 weeks, we've had 6 major decisions involving 4 pipelines that have caused a lot of excitement. The 4 pipelines are Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Keystone, Dakota Access, and Atlantic Sunrise. And while a lot of people have been thinking of this as a new era, a new day, the page is turned, etc., I am somewhat more skeptical. And I think the best way to look at these decisions is not part of a new era or in how agencies and courts deal with pipelines, but rather look at them as largely simply dealing with a traditional problem of how federal agencies issue permits under environmental statutes. 3 of the pipelines, Atlantic Coast, Dakota Access, and Keystone, are simply issues where federal agencies mucked up the environmental analyses called for by various statutes. One of them, Atlantic Sunrise, was a pipeline that dealt with, or the decision that dealt with FERC's procedure in issuing permits under the Natural Gas Act. And that one is somewhat different, but as you'll see, it also has largely procedural implications. We've been dealing with federal agencies issuing decisions that have ignored federal environmental statutes for half a century now, for 50 years. Countless courts have thrown out countless agency actions for failing to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, to comply with the Endangered Species Act, to comply with any one of other federal environmental laws. And there's been no discernible change in any agency behavior as a result of 50 years of such litigation, and these decisions won't change it either. And a case in point is the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a common culprit in Dakota Access, Keystone, and Atlantic Coast Pipeline. In Dakota Access, the Corps issued an easement under a lake on the Missouri River without doing any environmental analysis of it. And the court there said, I'm not going to allow Dakota Access to continue to operate until you go back and do the appropriate environmental analysis. In Keystone, a court said, you have a national program where you issue a general permit for building pipelines, oil and gas pipelines in streams and wetlands. You failed to do the appropriate environmental analysis and analysis under the Endangered Species Act, and I am telling you, you can't build on Keystone until you go back and do that analysis correctly. The judge actually even enjoined any oil or gas pipeline in the United States from relying on this general permit. The Supreme Court unfortunately stayed that part of the court's decision, but upheld it as to Keystone. So Keystone is stalled until such time as the court goes back and does the appropriate analysis. And the same thing happened in Atlantic Coast Pipeline. 3 weeks after the Supreme Court gave them a big victory by overturning the Fourth Circuit and allowing an easement for the pipeline underneath the Appalachian Trail, Atlantic Coast threw in the towel on the whole project. And it did so in part because the Corps' permitting had been stayed by a court, actually had been vacated by a court. Findings by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had been vacated by a court. And the delays caused by those and by dozens of other lawsuits filed by environmental groups and landowners it created time for environmental groups and others to go to the Virginia legislature and get them to pass a law saying by 2045 Virginia will only be using clean power. Since the entire purpose of ACP was to bring natural gas supplies into Virginia and North Carolina to build a new generation of gas-fired power plants, half the reason for the pipeline disappeared. And Dominion Power, which is ACP's parent, quietly admitted this in a filing with the state of Virginia. When this got out, all hell broke loose, and everyone realized that there was really no purpose to this pipeline anymore, and eventually the writing was on the wall, and ACP threw in the towel after several $billion being spent on this incredible boondoggle. The Corps will continue to do just what it's always done. The Corps' informal motto should probably be, proudly improving on Mother Nature since 1802. The Corps views its job as building things, and if it's not building them themselves, it's giving permits to other people to build things. That's what it does. And so they'll shrug and they'll continue to do it. So these are three excellent decisions, or in the case of Atlantic Coast, a decision by the company facing reality. But I don't think this, portends anything really new. I think there are three possible changes that we can see out of this, but they will, if we do see them, they will be only procedural and temporary. The first would be if other courts take Judge Morris's factual findings and legal conclusions in the Keystone case and apply them in their cases and also issue injunctions on a pipeline-by-pipeline basis. That would be great. But ultimately, that will only last until the Corps goes back, does what it was supposed to have done, and reissues the permit. It reach the same conclusions no matter what it finds. And so those pipelines will eventually be built, or at least that permit will eventually be reinstated. So no matter how many courts rely on it, it's a temporary reprieve. But delay is victory. As we saw in ACP, the longer you delay, the longer you can change political facts and you can work towards better solutions. The issue in Dakota Access was interesting and unique because it was the first time that a court said, we have a flawed agency permit and we're not just going to send it back to the agency, we're going to shut down the pipeline in the interim. And that's quite an accomplishment. The issue will be in the future. Will other courts regard that as an appropriate remedy when they're dealing with decisions and permits by federal agencies that have similar problems? If they don't follow this lead, then it'll be a one-off. If they do follow the lead, in this case, then it has the potential for actually changing things. Because right now, the calculus is, and always has been, by the pipeline companies and the agency, we can do steps 1 through 6 and then issue the permit, or we can skip steps 2 through 5, and who cares? We'll issue the permit, and if we get sued and we lose, the pipeline will have been permitted, it'll be built, it may already be operating, and then we can go back and fill in the blanks. So who cares? If courts start shutting things down as a result of that sort of sloppy agency process, that will change the calculus. Pipeline companies and agencies will say, whoa, we can skip all these steps. We've been doing that for 50 years, but we may be in the situation where the court comes back and orders the pipeline shut down. And how is that going to play out for you, Mr. Pipeline Company? So that has potential depending on what other judges do. The FERC decision in Atlantic Sunrise was very interesting. It was a victory for due process and constitutional rights. But I don't know how much good it will do in the long run, because what it means is, okay, you can go to court. When they're coming to take your land, you can go to the DC Circuit and you're suing FERC over its decision. But they can still take your land unless you get a stay of the eminent domain authority right at the outset. You're in court. You still have to get the court to say, don't use that eminent domain authority until we're finished deciding this case 2 years from now. Getting stays out of the DC Circuit is not easy. And part of the reason I will get to in 1 second, which is 2 years later, if you are successful in getting a stay, the court might will probably uphold the permit itself. And it'll be then, all systems go. The ultimate problem is not FERC's procedure. The ultimate problem is FERC's bad interpretations and bad policies and bad practices under the Natural Gas Act in how it determines whether pipelines are necessary and should be built. And until we can convince courts that what FERC is doing and has been doing for a long time is legally wrong and also really terrible policy, ultimately what you might be doing at best is simply delaying the inevitable. So in sum, what I'd say is, to borrow a phrase of a friend of mine, we're delighted with the run of good weather, but we should not mistake good weather for a change in the climate. So thank you very much, and open for questions.
Well, thanks everybody for those great presentations, Suzanne and Alex and David. We've got some great questions coming in now, so I'm just going to remind you, you can put a question in the chat box, and you can even give a thumbs up so that we can find out how many people like each of the questions. I want to start first with a question for you, Suzanne. In the Williams Pipeline case, how much of an effect did it have that New York State had just passed a climate law right before denying the Williams Pipeline?
That actually had an important effect because it was establishing standards that the utility was going to have to meet in its provision of energy. So it raised lots of questions about how a pipeline could possibly be compatible with this obvious statement of state policy on how energy should be going forward in the state of New York. So it had a big effect, I would say.
And you also mentioned the 14% return on equity. I imagine that also drives a lot of pipeline building. It definitely will change. I mean, that FERC has said maybe they're going to change.
Well, they issued a guidance in May that could shave a little bit off of that, but it's still going to be a very attractive thing. What New York is doing that's interesting is they're looking for ways to give utilities credit for making wise choices, for saving energy, for pursuing renewables, and they're essentially figuring out ways for them to profit from doing things that are consistent with the state policy. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops. The devil will be in the details, but a lot of people are involved in that effort right now.
Great. And Alex, you had said in your presentation that government could also limit or take away its borrowing of eminent domain that it gives to private companies. Do you think that it should do that, or we can't do that because of transmission lines?
Well, I think they can do that, and they just, particularly state legislatures who are in charge of the eminent domain for transmission lines, they just have to be careful about how they do it. In the past, when there's been a need to build particular projects, eminent domain has been expanded for those projects, and there's no reason that eminent domain can't be taken away. That's what happened for redevelopment, economic redevelopment projects after Kilo. Lots of states took action. So now that we have a climate crisis and we have more need for renewable energy and less need for fossil fuels, there's certainly advocacy that I think should be done in state legislatures to change the definition of public use, to limit the use of eminent domain for new fossil fuel projects, and potentially expand it for transmission lines that are designed to transport renewable energy. So I think that is certainly something that legislatures can do and at the present time should do.
Great. And David, if these recent victories are the weather and not the climate, how can we change the climate around pipelines?
I mean, ultimately, the issue with pipelines is demand. If there is no demand for the gas, then they're not going to build the pipelines. Or it's actually two things. One is demand, as Suzanne laid out in the Williams case, and also that's what contributed to the downfall of ACP. Once Virginia said, we only want clean energy in the future, and so there's no point in building this pipeline to supply new natural gas plants that we don't want. The other thing is the issue of cannibalization, which is the terrible overbuilding problem you get when FERC is awarding pipeline companies 14% rate of return on equity. That creates an enormous incentive to build new pipes and switch business from old pipes that you've long since depreciated and were coming in with a much lower rate of return. It's just simple. You give people that much money, that kind of return, they'll build.
Is that something that the Natural Gas Act reform could help? I mean, how could we change the 14% then?
Well, unfortunately it's set by FERC. The Natural Gas Act just gives FERC enormous discretion. It literally says if you find a pipeline to be an interstate gas pipeline to be in the public interest and for the public convenience and necessity, go ahead and build it. And it's up to FERC to decide what public convenience and necessity means. And it would be great if Congress were to wade in there and say, hold on a second, let's look carefully at what is in this day and age, not back in 1938, but now in 2020, what is public convenience and necessity when we're dealing with fossil fuel pipelines?
And that would have to come from Congress through.
Yeah. Or FERC would have to change its ways, and that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Well, let me turn to some of these questions, some of the more popular ones. We have Brindis Woods has a question from Massachusetts. Gas pipelines have become a flashpoint for grassroots opposition and organizing. Does this trend influence pipeline developers and investors in any way? If so, how? Alex, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, it depends. It really builds off, what David was saying. If there's money to be made, people will build. Certainly, a lot of grassroots advocacy can cause delay in pipelines, and investors don't like delay. And once, if a pipeline is seen as not going to be profitable, you'll see running away from that. Again, the Atlantic Sunrise, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is a great example of that. But that was driven, just as much or more by the change in the Virginia legislature in terms of what they wanted their energy future to look like. So delay can certainly help, but oftentimes you need more. And I'm sure David has more to say on that issue.
Well, I mean, putting on my ancient environmental hat, which I wore for a couple of decades before doing property rights work, delay from the environmental perspective, delay is victory. Because during that time, two things happen. One is things get more expensive, as Alex pointed out. And the second thing is it gives people time to organize to find a political solution, a long-term political solution, which is what happened in Virginia with ACP. But to get something like that for a pipeline, you need enormous resources. Think of the resources that have been thrown in on Dakota Access, and Dakota Access is up, and although temporarily not pumping, it still got built and was pumping away and eventually will resume pumping. It's very hard, given the amount of money at stake, to scare off companies. We've had a couple of victories, but big pipelines get built, and so many of them get built that no one knows about. There's unless you're in the pipeline world, you're completely unfamiliar with all these other pipelines that are getting built all the time.
Suzanne, you talked about need in the Williams case. Do you think that investors are starting to look at whether a pipeline might be denied on need?
I'm sure that they're looking at that now, and they're also probably looking at renewable energy, which is becoming more and more competitive. Certainly for years, the oil and gas industry really didn't have any competition, and that has changed, and that's making a difference. So I think that investors are looking at that factor. I mean, David's right. It's the end point is the end consumer. And if you have states saying, we're not going to do this anymore, investors are going to be looking at that.
Great. And Mike Brown from Earth Justice has a question. For conservative states like Louisiana that were part of the Kelo backlash, but that lack regulations on eminent domain for pipelines, do you have suggestions for tweaks to the law that might be appealing to property rights activists more broadly? Do you want to speak to that?
Well, there are a bunch of things. First of all, you have to distinguish eminent domain backlash from oil and gas. And I've talked to people, I've talked to Texas legislators and people in Louisiana, and eminent domain, terrible thing, terrible. Oh, but pipelines, whoa, that's oil and gas, and that's a different thing. And unfortunately, that's part of the mentality. Those are such large industries down there, so influential, so powerful, that it's going to be extremely difficult to get legislative solutions to stop the use of eminent domain. Let me just add two things. A lot of people aren't clear on who permits what. And the answer is all oil pipelines are permitted by the states that they go through. There's no federal eminent domain permitting for oil pipelines. Gas pipelines, if you call them interstate, then FERC permits them. If you call them intrastate, then the state permits them. And I won't get into it, but the FERC has for decades been very careful never to define the difference so that it can pick and choose on an individual basis whether something is intra or interstate. But Louisiana, we just had a terrible case of Bayou Bridge, and where we learned that, in fact, you don't need to get anything from the state. You simply decide, I'm going to build an oil pipeline, and you start sending out condemnation notices to landowners on the route. That's it. That's the Louisiana system. No notice to landowner, no environmental review, no economic review, no nothing. You just build it. Just build it. That's it. That's the Louisiana system.
One other point on that is this really differs from state to state. So when you are talking about oil pipelines or any pipelines that are not interstate natural gas pipelines, it is really difficult to have any real legislative change to eminent domain in a state like Texas or Louisiana when it comes to the oil industry. Other things, fine. But that's not true in all states. So you did see legislative change with regard to eminent domain on oil pipelines in Georgia and in South Carolina due to the landowner opposition to the Palmetto pipeline. Georgia and South Carolina don't have an oil and gas industry. You don't have people making money off of that industry. And so landowners, the legislature is just much more receptive to those claims by landowners. So there certainly is the possibility for legislative reform in a lot of states. But I do agree with David that in states that have a significant oil and gas industry, it's just going to be very, very difficult politically.
Although it's true that in Texas, the Cattle Ranchers Association and the Farm Bureau are together on their dislike of eminent domain. So maybe there's room for something to happen in the Texas legislature.
We could only hope.
The other thing to say about Texas is that it has also become a hotbed for wind energy development. And as these renewable energy sources become more firmly established, they will also develop their own political base of power. So, there may be other changes in the mix as we go forward.
Yeah.
In Texas, there's really room for both. There's been support for the wind industry and also for oil and gas. A counterpoint to that, of course, is North Dakota that has a very strong lignite coal industry. There's lots of wind in North Dakota, but those two energy resources compete directly against each other for wind replaces, coal-fired power. And so North Dakota has actually enacted state county moratoria on new wind development, even though it would provide a huge amount of money for residents and tax revenues, but they're trying to still prop up their coal industry. And they even considered a statewide wind ban, which did not pass the legislature. But that's something that's playing out right now as coal plants continue to close down in the upper Midwest. You see a tax on wind energy in North Dakota. You've not seen that in Texas, in part because oil doesn't compete directly with wind.
And even gas now in Texas doesn't really compete with wind because the gas is mostly going to two places. One, to the exploding, maybe that's a bad word to use when you're talking about natural gas, but the rapidly growing chemical industry on the Texas coast, cheap natural gas, they're loving it. And the second thing they do with the gas is simply export it as liquefied natural gas. Again, not competing with the wind guys. So you also have to figure out where exactly is the stuff going and who is it competing with.
So Segal Alisalad from Massachusetts has a question. Natural gas is often considered a transition fuel. To what extent are alternate energy sources considered in pipeline decisions? And how far ahead into the future do stakeholders weigh both the public benefits and the costs?
Alex, do you want to kind of give them the bad news?
Well, if you are in a state that does integrated resource planning for their electric utilities, which Minnesota, my state, does, so there each electric utility has to project out 15 or 20 years what their needs are going to be and what they're planning on building. And it's a big public process, and the Public Utilities Commission has to approve that. Minnesota also has laws that say you have to consider low-cost energy, you have to consider clean energy, and the preference is for renewable and carbon-free energy. So it's making it more difficult to build new gas plants, or at least giving advocates a reason to argue against the approval of new gas plants. But yes, the natural gas industry is certainly still arguing across the country. They are a transition fuel. They're needed, just like we used to hear about clean coal all the time. Now we have clean gas and transition gas. But frankly, renewable energy is our lowest cost energy resource in the United States right now in many, many parts of the country. Battery storage deals with a lot of the intermittency, and even more so than battery issues are just the fact that we have regional transmission organizations. We have multi-state grids that basically act as their own battery, because even if it's not windy or sunny in one part of that regional grid, it is windy or sunny elsewhere. So as a result of technological developments, I think there is, and the creation of these regional transmission organizations, there are much better arguments than there used to be about skipping over natural gas. We don't need it as a bridge fuel, and that's becoming a much more, I would say, mainstream position.
Yeah, that's that's at the kind of electric, at the level of producing electricity. There is that, and ultimately that will affect the pipeline world. But as far as FERC is concerned, you can throw as many analyses at FERC as you'd like, showing, look, there is no need for this gas here. There is no need. There's not increasing demand. There's not going to be increasing demand. And FERC does not care. FERC has one criteria. If someone has signed a contract to buy the gas, even if they're going to use that gas simply to that pipeline and that gas to replace existing pipelines and existing gas, and therefore accomplishing truly nothing, that's it. That's all that FERC cares about. They do not care how much you tell them that a particular state or city or region does not need new gas supplies. If there's a contract to buy it, FERC will approve the project.
Well, and that is why the state's role is so important, because that's where we've seen the changes happening most effectively, is by states getting in there and doing what they need to do. I think I also want to just comment, we hear the term natural gas a lot, but it's probably more accurate to call it fossil gas. I think the term came about initially to differentiate it from manufactured gas, which was a very toxic product made from coal. But I think it's a little more accurate and useful to refer to it as fossil gas. Certainly plenty. And I just want to add that is what the Long Island Power Authority did decide to do. They jumped the bridge. They went straight to renewables. They scrapped plans to expand natural gas energy use. So it is definitely happening.
So panelists, do you think it makes a difference if we push people to talk about fossil gas instead of natural gas? People sometimes say fracked gas, but I guess not all of the gas is fracked, so that's less accurate. What do you think? Does that language will that make a difference?
I'll leave that to the comms people to decide.
It probably depends on the audience that you're speaking with.
Yes, it's nice to have a different word other than natural gas, because it sounds quite so benign. And I know when Climate Nexus does their polling, people like that.
Well, there is legitimately biogas. I mean, you have methane digesters if you take all the hog waste off a farm, and you get the methane out of that, and you use that as a fuel. That's much cleaner than natural gas, because otherwise that methane is just going into the atmosphere. So you take that, you burn it, you convert it to carbon dioxide, and you've got something that's better. But that's things like that, and gas from landfills are just trivially small. But legitimately, there are things that are not, gas pulled out of, fossil gas pulled out of the ground.
And since we're at an IEFA conference, I'm going to ask this question. What level of money investment might it take, divestment by large-scale investors, to change the calculus for pipelines? This is from Vivian Orheit from Fossil Fuel California. So how much money would have to be restricted or divested to really make a difference in infrastructure projects? Are investors getting leery or no? As long as there's a supposed need and they get a 14% return on equity, I guess the pipeline developers won't stop, but
Yeah.
but
And
investments in
they're the
technology.
ones who are building it. I mean, they're the pipeline companies and the gas producers. The pipelines themselves are frequently owned. Large chunks of the pipelines are owned by either gas producers or gas consumers. It's one big cozy happy family, and as long as they think that they can make money out of it, the long-term thing really has to be decreasing demand.
And how about the idea that I thought it was interesting that the radical environmentalists did get the blame for stopping the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Do you see that changing with the environmentalists getting together with property rights activists? Does it seem like that's an effective strategy to push back at these pipelines, Suzanne?
Oh, it's certainly very helpful when landowners and environmental advocates can work together on a common goal. That's always a really useful thing to have happen. I also think that that environmentalists are speaking to the economic issues more and more, and I think that's helpful too for overall perception. Ultimately, it's going to come back at the local level to decisions that are made, and we need to look at ways to allow utilities to make profits doing the right thing, and that's really essential because they're going to want to make some money. That's why they're doing this. So we have to make sure that they can make money doing the right thing. Energy efficiency, renewables, that's really essential for them.
So Maya Weber has an interesting question. She's a journalist at S&P Global. Could you comment on how FERC's approach may change if it comes under Democratic leadership after the next election? So Alex and David, how might FERC change?
Well, certainly if Commissioner Glick has some help and he doesn't always have to write dissents, that would be a good thing. They have not had a full contingent at FERC for a while, but just this week, the White House put forward paired nominees, which was, there has to be a particular mix of Democrats and Republicans on the commission. And they serve for set terms, and so last time around when Commissioner Danley was appointed, he was put forward just on his own. There was a lot of criticism of that, but this week they put forward two. The Republican is the chair of the Virginia State Commission, and then Allison Clements from the Energy Foundation, who used to be at NRDC, as the Democratic one. They both, of course, have to go through ethics review and get confirmed by the Senate. But then, regardless of whether there's a change in presidents after the 2020 election, that group would still be in place. You'd still have a Republican majority, at least for a while. So I don't know that you would see any big changes soon, but certainly eventually, if we did have a change in presidential administrations, there would be an opportunity for new FERC commissioners, and you could see FERC moving in a different direction. But even with a change in the commission makeup, there's still what the statute says, what the Natural Gas Act says and doesn't say about taking into account environmental protection issues and how to determine need. And you still may have commissioners that say, hey, we need more direction from Congress if we're going to make any real changes.
David, might FERC change under Democratic president?
Well, I'd love to see it happen. I'm just skeptical it will.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. This has been extremely interesting. I encourage everybody to join us in the chat room to have a little more discussion. And I understand that AIFA's presentations are going to be available online, so you can always go back in and look at the presentations and of this or anything that you may have missed. I think all of the panelists are also going to join us in the chat over at Swapcard. So please join us as well. And I want to say a big thank you to Suzanne, Alex, and David for this great conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you,
you.
Rebecca. Let me just echo that to all of you. Thanks so much, Alexandra and David and Suzanne and Rebecca, for a great and in-depth conversation. In addition to joining us here in Swapcard, you can also join the live Twitter conversation at hashtag IEFA 2020. At the conclusion of this session, we're going to play the next in our series of videos on local leadership, global change, and it's highly relevant to today's session. It's a wonderful piece on the work of Indigenous climate action in Canada, led by Ariel Deranger, and the work that they are doing to protect their communities and homelands from oil sands development. We hope that you will stay for that video. It takes about 10 minutes. And we also hope you'll join us tomorrow for the closing session of Energy Finance 2020, where we're going to focus on political leadership in global climate change, divestment, and the energy transition. Thanks so much for joining us, and goodbye.
Eklanete dene sotlaneta Ariel Ekwe Hushe Deranger Betsiani Hesli. My name is Ariel Ekwe Deranger, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation and the Executive Director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Indigenous Climate Action is Canada's first Indigenous-led climate justice organization. And the mandate and the vision of our organization is to empower and inspire Indigenous communities to be sovereign and self-determining nations and building their own Indigenous-led climate action strategies across the country. One of the most compounding and intersectional issues in social justice is climate justice. And in Canada, or so-called Canada, there are many Indigenous peoples working on issues that could support climate solutions, but are often not looked at or supported in that way. So how do we look at Indigenous climate action as viable solutions for tomorrow? We have unique rights of Indigenous peoples that have been defined under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which looks at our collective rights as communities, but also our collective rights in relationship with the natural world. And so Indigenous rights come with their own very tangible connection to ecosystems, landscapes, and places in which we have come from. The word dene in my language, when you break it down in its root form, means to flow from the land. So we have these unique systems, but those systems and values haven't been included in the way that we look to frame economic systems of modern governance, education, and so on and so forth. And as the climate disaster has increased, so have many of the injustices towards Indigenous peoples. Not being able to access clean, healthy water because many of our communities are still connected to the land. My community, the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, until about 30 years ago was 80% subsistence. 80% subsistence. And the only reason that number has decreased is because of the imposition of oil and gas projects within our territory and the contamination and degradation to our ecosystems, making those subsistence foods unsafe to eat.
I grew up in the boreal forest, so we were very land-based people. When I was a kid, 70% of our food came from the land. So we ate, wild chickens, rabbits, ducks, deer, moose. We also picked a lot of berries. And our water. We got our water from the ground. I'll never forget how clean and fresh and cold that water was. Experiencing the changes, being really land-based, to all of a sudden we have water being hauled to us, this treated water that tasted like bleach. I understood that there was changes happening.
So Indigenous climate action was really born out of this need from Indigenous communities to see themselves as a part of addressing the climate crisis. For about 15 years, I was working within the environmental and climate justice movement in so-called North America. And there weren't a lot of Indigenous peoples leading these conversations, participating in these conversations. And yet our communities were often asked to give words or share their knowledge. But they weren't being included at some of the highest levels of discussions, but rather we were just there to talk about how bad climate change was for us. It's kind of like that sort of victimization model. And so in 2015, I, leaned on a lot of friends and allies, put together an advisory council, and formed the first inaugural meeting for Indigenous climate action in January of 2016, which brought together about 150 Indigenous representatives from across the nation to discuss climate change with some of the leading Indigenous voices in climate justice, like Tom Goldtooth, Art Manuel, Winona LaDuke, Ellen Gabriel, Chief Stuart Phillip, all these really incredible voices that have been participating in the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change, that have been participating in many UN dialogues, as well as national and regional policies on climate change, to show folks we are a part of the conversation, and we do have value in these conversations. At the end of 2017, it became like a full-fledged organization, because between 2015 and 2017, it was all volunteer. I had another full-time job, and I was doing it off the side of my desk. I took a leap of faith. I quit my job where I was working for my First Nation, and I decided to help steer the ship of what has now become Indigenous climate action.
Ariel is one of the most powerful people that I've gotten the pleasure of meeting in my life. I met Ariel a few years ago at the Indigenous Climate Action gathering that we had out in Cold Lake First Nations, where I'm from. We really got to know each other when we went to Ecuador together to bear witness to the Wadani case to protect 500,000 acres of Amazon rainforest.
5% of the global population is Indigenous peoples, but we protect and steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. We are the protectors of the land.
The Reject Tech campaign was a huge one. They were creating this mega project in the north.
We already had issues with how much fresh water was being used, how much land was being cleared, how much air pollution was happening, deforestation. And then all of a sudden comes a company like Tech saying that they're going to be the biggest project to date.
The project was this massive project in an area that had been completely untouched, basically for millennia. There is nothing up there, no development, no transmission lines, no roads, nothing. And they started doing exploration drilling for the Tech Frontier mine. And in order for this project to be developed, they would need to develop a bridge that got across the river to the area. They'd have to develop roadways and systems. They'd have to pull in transmission lines so that they could power the operations or build a power station. They would have to build an airstrip. They would have to build in a massive amount of infrastructure just to power one project. For fighting this project, it became about how do we create awareness? How do we get more information to ensure that people understand that this project is, in fact, moving us in the wrong direction? When we can take information from institutions like IEFA, bring them to the table and say, this isn't just about us being angry that we can't hunt, fish, and trap, but this is about a project that is not economically viable and that is being criticized as part of an international movement that we need to move away from fossil fuels, period. End of story. Like, these are our allies in this movement. And so we took it upon ourselves to make tech one of the biggest issues of the UN COP meeting. So the UNFCCC COP 25 in Madrid. We ran this campaign at the COP. We called it Reject Tech. We asked Canada to reject the Joint Review Panel recommendation to approve the project, and ran this campaign for a few months.
There was a lot happening, and we were really trying to figure out the different ways that the minister might take it. If he was to approve, if he was to deny, and if he was to approve with conditions. We were thinking about trying to head out to Ottawa and do some lobbying. There's plans underway for different kinds of direct action. We saw the group Extinction Rebellion doing National Day of Actions.
There were protests happening all over the place. People were pretty upset about this project. And as Canada continued to sit on whether or not they were going to approve, Tech came forward and just said, you know what? We're going to reject ourselves, because they realized that In fact, just like many of the IEFA reports had stated and other reports, that this was not an economically smart investment, that this was a project that had a lot of contention around it, and that it was no longer in their best interest to move forward with the project, and the project was canceled.
That pristine forest up there is going to be pristine for a lot longer now. So that's a beautiful thing.
There's just so much knowledge we have because we are in the communities on the water all the time, not just to go for a hiking trip or a camping trip. We live there. So we know the land and the history of the land. I really encourage people to take the time to learn more about Indigenous rights, because Indigenous rights is tied to protecting the land. And if our Indigenous rights are protected, it ensures that you have an existence, that your kids have a future, because we're working hard to protect the land, not only for us, but for everybody.
We still have an opportunity to safeguard what's left. And we can do that together with allies and partnership, and empowering our communities to really pave the way for what an Indigenous climate justice future looks like, which isn't just about, making sure we've reduced the greenhouse gas emissions or have solar power, because we need all of those, but it also must include what it means to be in relationship with the land, to be dene, to flow from the land.